legalizefreedom.com.
Good evening. I'm Greg Moffat of legalizefreedom.com. You can spell legalize with an S or a Z, and that's legalize-freedom.com. And today I want to say a word about COVID-19 and 9/11. For those of us who lived through 9/11 and its aftermath, there are some uncomfortable echoes increasingly to be found in our current situation. Here we find ourselves in December 2020, almost a year into the pandemic. The first thing I would say about 9/11, having lived through it and seen how that was assimilated and processed or not by our civilization afterwards, and comparing that with the current situation, is that 9/11 is a textbook example, and the coronavirus crisis is playing out to be a textbook example of things which are not what they at first appear to be. That is perhaps, if there was only one takeaway from all this, then to think about, then that would be it. It struck me in the early days of this, for us in Western Europe anyway, back in March, that I'd seen this movie before, I told myself. I was seeing history being written in real time and a lot of chaos and confusion about what was happening. Sources of information coming to us, most people get their information from mainstream media, broadsheet newspapers, the larger internet news sites, and we were getting a constant barrage of information, more information than we've ever had about any other unfolding situation in my lifetime. I mean, I thought there was a lot of information, speculation and disinformation on the day of 9/11 and in the aftermath, but nothing on this. So the similarity was a rush, a tidal wave of information, speculation, disinformation, do this, don't do that, from all levels, not just media, government as well. And as in the wake of 9/11, there were a lot of mixed messages. And I don't mean mixed messages that are simply born of chaos and confusion, but mixed messages that seem to be deliberately switched at a certain juncture. For example, you'd be getting, as I say, one bit of information about this is happening, and then suddenly that's no longer happening, or this is the most important thing in the situation, suddenly it is no longer the most important thing. Priorities can change as new information comes along. But as with 9/11, there were mixed messages that weren't, they didn't feel like they were information adapting to circumstances, people reacting appropriately to circumstances. They'd seem to be, if not arbitrary, then inexplicable. Up is down, black is white, left is right. One of the classic examples is with ways to protect yourself in the pandemic situation, from ways to protect yourself from infection. Social distancing, wearing of masks, hygiene, cleaning procedures, lots of these basically being advised or not advised, and then that information switching around. And some people said, well, yeah, they're adapting to the situation as information becomes available. But this isn't a new type of virus. All the cleaning procedures and personal protective equipment, none of those are new. We've got a long history of using those or not using them in certain situations. So the idea that we've got no experience to go on and that we were dealing with a completely new situation is entirely false. But the same thing happened in the wake of 9/11. It was like this was a very novel event. Nothing like this had ever happened before, ever. No plane had ever crashed into a tall building. No terrorists had ever hijacked a vehicle. The Middle East, terrorists from the Middle East had never struck in this way before. Maybe they hadn't on American soil, but they certainly had. So the mixed messages simply added to the already burgeoning chaos and confusion. And what emerged from all of this, of course, is what you might expect people would want in a situation like that, which is some kind of clarity. Please just tell us what's going on because we can't work it out. And what you then get, which we got on the day of 9/11 and very quickly in the early days of the pandemic, was very simple messaging. I know I just spoke about confused messaging, but what emerged from that was very, very simple messaging about what was happening and what to do. And despite the switching of priorities and the mixed messaging, there was a high degree of certainty within a couple of hours of the incidents on the morning of 9/11 about who had done this, why, who, when, where, why, how, basically. There were pundits on TV laying it all out, naming Osama bin Laden, for example, and Al-Qaeda, talking about the number of hijackers, where they hijacked the plane, blah, blah, blah. And so in certain circles, in certain arenas, as the pandemic situation began to unfold, there seemed to be people with a miraculous level of certainty about what was going on. And it was a very, very simple story, very, very black and white. And since then, the narrative has continued to leave very little room for nuance and subtlety, as was the case in the wake of 9/11. It's here's what you need to do, here's why, do it, don't ask questions. And this is a way of, this sort of very simplistic messaging is a way of trying to deal with people's cognitive dissonance, because it's something that you experience when your mental map of reality, your picture of the world does not fit with the information you're being given, what you're being told from outside. And most people do have a sort of an internal compass when it comes to reality in their own lives, but it tends to be dormant or latent, and they rely very much on guidance from external forces and sources. But in situations of high stress, that internal compass will sometimes be activated, and they will then experience enormous cognitive dissonance. But instead of perhaps observing that internal compass or listening to that inner voice, they will block that in order to deal with the cognitive dissonance, the clash, the friction between what they see, what they feel, what they're actually experiencing versus what they're being told is happening, the who, why, when, where, and how of their subjective reality versus that which is coming from outside. For more of this, you can see my video, COVID-19, where exactly is the pandemic. Another parallel between 9/11 and its aftermath and the current situation is the idea that not only do we not have time for nuance and subtlety, there isn't time to ask any questions. It's like in the Prisoner TV series with Patrick McGoohan from the 60s. Questions are a burden. Answers a prison for the mind. So, and I well remember my first reaction to 9/11 as I watched it, not live, but as I watched that endless repeat all day. And it was very much like the program we have now with the 24/7 media of just like virus. Then back then it was just every 2 minutes they were showing the planes hitting the towers. And what I came up with was questions, a lot of them. And a lot of people had them as well. And we felt that the answers that were being offered were at best partially adequate. But again, we've been going through this now. I mean, this is much more protracted, obviously, than 9/11. 9/11 has had a long-lasting effect, but the thing itself, it was a few hours, and basically it was all over in its kinetic form anyway. So yeah, this current situation much more protracted, but it's been ongoing. It's just stop asking questions. We don't have time for that, and in fact, it's dangerous. You shouldn't be asking questions. It doesn't matter what they are. You just have to accept our answers. So, and that's, you know, a disturbing parallel. With no time for reflection, what reflection gives you time, the opportunity to do is to think about your next move. And in the wake of 9/11, there was very little time taken. You had a massive piece of legislation in the US, for example, in the shape of the Patriot Act, that was ready to go, basically. Here's one we made earlier. Just sign here and go with that. And the same has happened in the COVID crisis. No time to reflect on what action we should take. Those processes have been nullified by circumstances, and we just need to we know what we need to do. Here's some we made earlier. We need to go ahead with those. And of course, it's not that nobody has ever thought about the possibility of a pandemic and how we as a global society should react to it. Though, again, some people would lead you to believe that they haven't thought about that, because international organizations drill for it. And there were drills just prior to 9/11 for terrorist attacks of that sort. And there was the famous drill, I'll come to that in a minute, which was taking place in late 2019, which was rehearsing a response to a global pandemic. One thing I did think personally in the wake of 9/11 that the US government should have considered doing was, rather than rushing to act and wheeling out all this pre-prepared stuff and putting it in place a knee-jerk reaction, of course, people who say that it was problem, reaction, solution scenario, then of course they were going to act immediately because that's what the situation was set up to do. But I thought the US government should have done nothing. That, I think, would have been more disturbing and disconcerting to any other terrorist groups than anything else, you know. And then they could have said, okay, we will find out who did this and we'll come for you. And you won't know when that will be, you won't know where, but we'll come for you. So maybe that wasn't a set of circumstances or a path of action that was strictly applicable to the actual circumstances of 9/11, but just a moment to pause, I thought at the time would have been a good idea. But of course we don't have time for that now, because people are dropping in the streets, except that they're not. So we have to react, and we can, shoot now and ask questions later, basically. Seems to be the mantra. Christian Morris, Irish commentator, you can find him on YouTube. He's been a guest of mine on legalizedfreedom.com. He recently did a video in which he was talking about the current US election, and he was drawing a line between the assassination of JFK, the events of 9/11, and the current farce that's playing out in the US, sorting out Trump and Biden, who's actually going to be president. Either way, as I see it, the whoever ends up getting installed will be completely illegitimate in the eyes of at least half the population, but that's not the point. When Christian was talking about the tendency that gave rise, the forces that gave rise to the assassination of John F. Kennedy, and the forces that were in play in the events of 9/11, I see those in play now, not in the US election, that they are, but I also see that in the pandemic crisis. So it's another, perhaps another red line that you could maybe draw between those events. And that's not to apply a conspiracy lens to everything. I mean, again, conspiracy is just a name for a thing which is real enough. And people talk about a particular view of an event or a set of circumstances, oh, that's a conspiratorial view. That's someone's opinion. Depends where you draw the line of conspiratorial. But I still think that there's a tendency in human nature, there's a outburst in human affairs. There are, how can I put it? There are ripples in the water of human affairs that you can see similarities between. And I think that the current situation we're looking at, like I said earlier, we've seen this movie before. Any of us who've been around for a while, this is not new. In thinking about the events currently unfolding, I would apply a methodology, a way of looking at things literally, that I spoke a lot about after 9/11, which is if you're trying to work out what's going on, say what you see. Don't try and overthink things, don't try and overcomplicate them. The situation may be complex and it may not be the black and white scenario I spoke about earlier that we get presented to us, but there are ways of seeing the wood for the trees, essentially. Because in many situations that people puzzle over and, global situations, world events, oh, what's happening? We just can't understand it. Some people seem to have the ability to see it very clearly. No, this is what's happening. Look, strip out the noise and you will be able to see what's going on here. So I would say try and apply that lens to what's going on at the moment. If you're interested. Now, we are told a couple of things when it comes to, you and I trying to figure out what's going on in the world. One is, or is particularly being told this at the minute, do not do your own research. You can't trust yourself, you're not qualified. And generally, as a species in the scientific age, we're told don't pay any attention to your heart or your gut or any instincts like that. That's not scientific. Okay, well, I'd refute all of that. It doesn't mean that you should live or be guided entirely by what your heart says or what your gut tells you or what your spidey sense, your sixth sense tells you about a situation, or that if you look into a situation from a layman's point of view, even an informed layman's point of view, then maybe you're not qualified to make judgments about science that people who spend all their lives working on it still haven't really got to grips with. That's fine. But this idea that you should just plug into the media matrix and just sit there and be fed everything. It's like, it's like never making a meal for yourself, just, eating paste out of a tube, because somebody else has put it. It's nutritionally, it's all everything you need is there, and don't do anything for yourself. And we've seen throughout this pandemic, increasing numbers of people left in a position through no choice of their own where they're unable to care for themselves, So it's no wonder people are not feeling particularly inclined to think more deeply about the situation that's happening around them, or to do the research, or even to trust themselves, because it feels like even though a lot of people have lost their livelihoods and their ability to care for themselves through no fault of their own, there's a lot of people feeling bad about this because they think they failed. They think they're inadequate. They think they weren't up to this challenge. But I would say, you trust yourselves a little bit more. And one interesting exercise when we're looking at situations like this, I did the same thing with 9/11, is we've seen this movie before, remove yourself from it, resign from the cast, okay? So look at unfolding events that are happening now as if they were on TV screen, which for many people, that's really only where they exist. But when you're watching a film, even if it's something like The Usual Suspects or some other mind bender, think about it when you've watched a complex film, a challenging film, maybe a murder mystery, or just something where what the hell is going on? At some point, mostly, you begin to figure out what's happening. Okay, I know why he did that, and did that. I know why she said that. I understand what's happening. Okay, now it's beginning to dawn on me. Okay, so take yourself out of this movie. Start looking at the news like it's a plot for a sci-fi dystopia or a disaster aftermath film. Start looking at it like that. These people are characters. Events are a script. So start thinking about it in those terms and figure out who the good guys are, who the bad guys are, where this came from, what's happening, where it's going. Start thinking about it in those terms. It's an interesting exercise. I'd be very interested to know what anybody comes up with if they perform that exercise. At this juncture, I'm just going to briefly invite you to, please, consider subscribing to this YouTube channel and also head over to my all-new website, legalize-freedom.com. I've had it revamped. You can subscribe to a newsletter there, scroll down to the bottom. You can also get membership there. I'm mentioning it now because you do it at the end of the video. As soon as you start wrapping up, people switch off. And then the little reminder to consider subscribing is lost amidst the end titles. Another very important parallel with 9/11 is I was struck how quickly after the terrorist attacks of September 11th, 2001, people began forgetting the details of them. In the weeks and months that followed, for a lot of people, it started to get very hazy. It faded in importance for them because they realized it wasn't an immediate existential threat, which they thought it might have been within the first couple of days. And stuff started to get memory hold. So details of it, oh, do you remember, they found that passport and this guy did that, and the people started to memory hold things that actually happened and misremember. So they'd remember things that did not happen. They would say, oh yeah, of course there were no planes. Well, there were planes. There was no plane at the Pentagon. Yes, there was. The people who were at the Pentagon said there was no wreckage. So Pentagon looked like a missile strike. It certainly looks like a plane hit World Trade Center. Well, I can't remember if it was one or two initially. And they forget about Building 7. Building 7. What's Building 7? Look it up. That was not talked about much at the time, and again, it's been memory hold. And when I said earlier about say what you see, the good example of that in 9/11 is what I saw, and I'm not here to regurgitate all the 9/11 stuff, but I am, making this comparison. Was a controlled demolition, and you don't have to attach any emotion to that, any agenda, nothing whatsoever, no objectives, no desired outcome. I just said at the time, that's what it looks like to me. I've seen a couple in real life. I've seen a few on TV. I've seen a couple of shows with Fred Dibnah where they're demolishing smokestacks. That's what that looks like. I've seen a few council. Once when I lived in Teesside, I went to see a council tower block, 10-story tower block, brought down by controlled demolition. Great entertainment that was. It's exactly like on 9/11. So, applying that to the current situation, trust these, say what you see. Say what you see. And when I mentioned things being memory hold and people forgetting the details of what's just happened, already you can see people, Thomas Sheridan's done some very good stuff on this, incidental commentary on some of his videos. Remember, flatten the curve, 3 weeks to flatten the curve back in March in the UK. What about there? If you remember that, that's good, because that was a thing. Those TikTok videos with the nurses and some doctors in highly, for amateurs, highly sophisticated, well coordinated and extensively rehearsed dance routines in empty hospital wards. And people have said, oh, well, they were just trying to relax between shifts. Maybe that's not the point. The point is for some people like, oh, was that a thing? No, that's a conspiracy theory. That didn't happen. People banging pans. I can't remember if it was Wednesday or Thursday night. See, there you go. I'm already thinking, was it Wednesday night that they banged the pots or was it Thursday night? Either way, at 8 o'clock it happened. I haven't forgotten. But for some people, that might as well be something they did in the wake of 9/11. After 9/11, we all made paper planes and, threw them out of our windows. Actually, that'd probably be in bad taste, but anyway. And of course, back when all this was just getting going, people dropping dead in the streets in China. Yeah, that was a thing. Remember the photographs? I don't remember there was footage from China at that time, but the famous one of people sparked out on the pavement outside grocery stores, I think those were just still images. But that was a thing. And these are just a handful of the things that already seem to be fading off, potentially into a memory hole, where at some point it'll be just gone. It just won't matter anymore. And I can see the future mythology of the COVID-19 pandemic being put into place now, and I can see already the list of omissions forming in my mind, what we're going to lose, what's going to be worth keeping, trying to identify things as they unfold, as they happen now, day by day and week by week, and say, will this survive the edited narrative in future? Back in the wake of 9/11, there were just like book after book like this. This is actually quite a good one. It's one of the few I've read. I've read a lot about 9/11, but this 9/11 revealed, challenging the facts behind the war on terror. There are already books like this about the current situation. But equally, with things being forgotten and memory hold, who does anyone publish books like this anymore? Will we get to a point in the future where it's like, oh, COVID-19, it's history? We may still be living with the effects of it. That may be for the rest of our lives. But as a historical phase, it will become like something that had an effect on the future, but it in itself has kind of vanished like a thief in the night. I know this is off a little bit of a tangent, but I want to mention it because it's very interesting. Parallel between 9/11 and the current situation, and that involves archetypal astronomy. Now, I don't have time to go into that now, but it is the effect, and bear with me on this one, the effect of planetary bodies on human affairs. But this is not a kinetic direct effect like the moon's effect on the tides on the Earth. Some people misapprehend this idea about astrology and think it's all to do with actual physical forces on human bodies. It's not, but there are parallels, well documented. And for more about what might actually be happening, probably the best place to start is see the work of Richard Tarnas, Tarnas. He's written extensively on this, and he's done some videos about the archetypal astrology of our current situation, because it's uncannily similar to that around the time of 9/11, and of course other very impactful, significant world events down the ages. And they say the first casualty of war is truth, and that's why I mention about what version of the coronavirus crisis we'll end up with in the years to come. They say that truth is the daughter of time and not of authority, and by that the saying means that it doesn't matter what you're being told the truth is by the establishment or media or any form of authority, that only time will tell. The truth will out eventually. My concern about that is, in our lifetimes anyway, is that whether it's JFK or whether it's 9/11 or any of the other big, they get called, conspiracy realms, but any of the other big questions that are still hotly debated of our time, that there's still a fog of doubt, uncertainty, and unanswered questions. And as things get forgotten in memory hold, I can see us marching on into whatever brave new world we do, with all those questions left hanging. Something that tickled me greatly, just on a final point actually, was another radio guest of mine. He's been on several times, Jason Horsley, on a recent episode of his podcast, The Liminalist. He was discussing the coronavirus crisis, and he made reference to the mark of the beast. And he said they were talking about, him and his guest were talking about various things that are looming now, whether it's implantable chips, health passports, the possibility of, if not mandatory, vaccines and strongly encouraged, cashless society, how it's getting increasingly difficult to do anything without a smartphone. And Jason said, isn't it funny, so many people down the decades, even centuries, spoke about a coming time, the end times and the mark of the beast. And now that it's here, his words, but I enjoyed what he had to say about it. Now that it's here, people are like, yeah, mark of the beast, isn't it? Just got to get on with it. And it made me think about some of the people, and this is I'm thinking about David Icke here, and I did a recent video, David Icke, Is He Right?, which you should check out, my thoughts on him. But it made me reflect on when I was growing up in the 1980s, Earlier than that, of course, but particularly in the 1980s, you had a certain strand, a certain type of evangelical preacher in the US who spoke a lot about this sort of thing. They talk about a coming control grid. You will not be able to, it's a revelation stuff, you will not be able to buy or sell, work, travel, save you wear the mark. You will be outcast if you don't wear the mark of the beast. That's the only way you'll be able to function in society. So, food for thought, perhaps. So, that's all for today. Until next time, I'm Greg Moffat, and you've been listening to legalizefreedom.com.
legalizefreedom.com